Hello everyone and welcome to Archeo Viking. This video is going to be one of the videos in my series on early colonial debacles that disprove the myth of inherent European superiority, specifically the myth of inherent superiority of the European colonial powers. The subject of this video is the subjects of this video are the Chickasaw Wars and specifically the Chickasaw victory over the French Empire. So you might be asking, what do you mean by the French Empire? Well, I'm sure everyone watching this video is aware of, who the country of France is or the Kingdom of France is, a country that's been around for roughly 1,000 years or so, give or take, at least in its current, you know, in some form of its current political boundaries. Of course, that's shifted over time, but it's a country we're all fairly well aware of. However, uh, it did not stay this shape that uh, it was in for hundreds of years and is currently in now. During the colonial period from the 1500s up until the latter half of the 20th century, France had a massive colonial empire. And one of its earliest colonial imperial territories was actually located in North America. Uh, it was what was known as New France, and it was divided up in several different colonies, including the colonies of Louisiana and Quebec and things like that. Uh, and fairly early on in their imperial career, we'll say, they encountered a very powerful Native American nation in the southeastern portion of North America, known as the Chickasaw Nation, who would be one of their most ardent Native American opponents in the region, arguably the most ardent Native American opponent to the French Empire in this region. Which actually brings us to our first section of the video, uh, Chickasaw society. Because, of course, before we get into the Chickasaw Wars themselves, we need to, learn about and get to know the people who were involved in this conflict. Starting with Chickasaw culture. So, right off the bat, it's important to note that Chickasaw culture was the polar opposite in a lot of ways of European culture and, of course, by proxy, French culture. So, French culture and European culture is by and large, or by and large, patrilineal societies, meaning the kinship is traced through the father's line. You like to say, for example, you take your father's last name and things like that. Chickasaw culture was a matrilineal society, meaning kinship is traced, was traced, and still is traced through the female line. A person is identified with their mother's lineage. Property is passed down through the mother's family, and children are born into the clan of the mother and take their social status from it. And then, as an extension of that, they were matrilocal, meaning when a young couple married, they would live with their with a woman's family, which again is in the polar opposite of European cultures. Uh, in Chickasaw society, women were the ones who were in charge of agriculture, planting, and harvesting the crops, as well as they were the ones who owned the agricultural fields. And this is actually the case for, I'd say, like 99% of Native American cultures, at least in the eastern woodlands and most of the Great Plains Native American cultures as well, and in the Southwest as well. There are a few exceptions throughout the Americas, but generally, this is, at least in North America, this is the standard cultural practice. Meanwhile, men were the ones who were generally chiefs or Minkos, as they would be called in Chickasaw, society and language. They were also in charge of war. They were the ones who would go out and hunt animals, and they would oversee public ceremonies. And here are all the sources that I used for that. And then we come to Chickasaw warfare. So, warfare in Chickasaw society was very much an important way for men to gain social prestige. Warfare generally consisted of raids and ambushes and was often focused on obtaining captives, as well as obtaining control of hunting territory rather than outright conquest and subjugation. Warriors would employ strategies such as hiding in the forests during the day, traveling at night, attacking at daybreak while their enemies slept, walking single file in the same footprints to confuse enemy warriors, and using well fortified villages for defense during a siege, which will actually be very important in this video. The Chickasaw, in particular, were very well known amongst Native American and European nations for their mastery of waterborne combat due to their proximity to the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, often being noted to hide secret caches of canoes for quick escape, as well as using rivers to quickly defend their very large territory, while also using rivers to raid French ships and settlements, as well as rival Native American nations. Often the Chickasaw Nation and other Native American nations would use the game stickball as a substitute for war to settle disputes between nations and villages. Um, Also, Chickasaw and Native American nations of the Eastern Woodlands would also use stickball as a way to train young men in the ways of war because of how rough it could be. For context, stickball is the direct ancestor to lacrosse. So if you have seen how violent lacrosse is, multiply that for stickball to a point. I mean, people could die in stickball, but and did in a lot of cases, but it was nowhere near as bloody or as lethal as like full scale war. And so, because of all of these practices, this would eventually lead to stickball being called the little brothers of war. Another important thing to note is that the Chickasaw Nation was, by and large, less populous than most of the southeastern Native American nations, never having a population that exceeded maybe between 7 to 8,000 individuals, though with their average population usually being more like around 3,000 to 5,000 individuals in between the period from 1685 to 1835 CE. However, the number of warriors the Chickasaw Nation could field has a constant estimate of roughly 2,000 warriors, with a ratio of warriors to general population being 7 to 2 at the lowest and 3 to 2 at the highest. So, a very large number of warriors to the general population. So if they had 5,000, a population of 5,000 and 2,000, they would have 2,000 warriors out of that. So, that's a very significant amount of warriors they could put towards any kind of war effort. And here is where I got that source. This is a master's thesis by Wendy Segilski, titled GIS-based analysis of Chickasaw settlement in northeast Mississippi. And you can see here that's generally what was found, that generally the Chickasaw population had a rough average, a fairly consistent average of only about 5,000 people in the entire nation itself, with maybe at its earliest having a little higher of that at 7 to 8,000 people. And here is a picture of stickball here. And with that in mind, we now need to go and take a look at what the Chickasaw warriors and weapons that they used looked like in the 1700s CE. So during the early 1700s CE, Chickasaw warriors generally looked something like this or this. And they wielded a variety of different weapons. When it came to up close combat, they wielded uh, various different types of war clubs. And I do want to make the caveat, I know this is a tomahawk here, and that, and they did use that. The Chickasaw very much did use tomahawks, axes of sort in combat. Uh, that being said, tomahawks are actually a subset of the weapon type known as war club. So they most certainly did use tomahawks, but it was just one of the various types of war clubs that they used. The other types included things that would become known as gun stock war clubs, because they looked very roughly like the stock of a musket. And they would often, uh, again, be shaped sort of like the stock of a musket, sort of also looking like, what you would assume, say, a scimitar or some other type of curved sword looks like. And they would often have uh, sticking out of them one or more metal blades that had been attached to them. Though there were also some examples like this one here that were just made completely out of hardwood and were just used sort of like, say, akin to a, like say you're bashing somebody with a baseball bat or something like that, just using it for the blunt force trauma, which could be fairly effective in on its own. And then they had other types of war clubs that were sort of vaguely shaped like, say, a European mace, that again were used generally for the blunt force trauma. And then after contact with Europeans like the British and the French, they began using steel knives. And I say steel for a reason, and that's because before contact with Europeans, there most certainly was metalworking in the Americas, and I will link my dedicated video to that in the iCard. Uh, but it was based predominantly off of copper and bronze. Now, there were some exceptions to that in the Pacific Northwest, but that was mainly the use of things like ship iron, iron from shipwrecks that had floated to the Americas, say from Asia. The widespread use of steel knives was not, uh, steel knives were not used in a widespread manner by Native American nations until after contact with Europeans. And then, of course, the Chickasaw warriors wielded longbows, like you see here, and these were very effective weapons on themselves. In fact, early European uh, explorers and military expeditions, like the Pasoto expedition, noted how the longbows utilized by the Native American nations of the Southeast could most certainly pierce their armor, and were just as accurate, if not more accurate, than their muskets. And they had a better firing rate. I mean, after all, firing one musket every couple of minutes versus being able to fire off 3 or 4 arrows in that same time span, that's a pretty big advantage. But that being said, muskets were more powerful overall, and so over time, uh, most Native American nations of the Americas, not just the southeastern, but overall, begin to sort of see that power as a acceptable trade-off for, say, the firing rate and the accuracy. And so the Chickasaw Nation, among other Native American nations in all of the Americas, began to adopt muskets from uh, in the case of the Chickasaw, primarily the British, but also French and Spanish and Dutch and things like that. All right, now that brings us to the next facet of Chickasaw society that I want to discuss, and that is the government of the Chickasaw Nation. So the Chickasaw government, uh, generally, the Chickasaw Nation as a whole is generally divided into 2 groups, the chopped hickory and the worn house division. And then ruling this, like leading the Chickasaw Nation as a whole was the National Council, and still is the National Council, which is the governing body of the Chickasaw Nation, and it consisted of leaders and accomplished warriors who were chosen by each village and town to take a seat at the council. Now, there was a peace chief called a Minko, uh, who was in charge of peace and foreign relations, and he was selected by the National Council based on merits and possibly membership in a prominent clan. Meanwhile, there was the assistant to the Minko who supervises the National Council and is spoken and is the advisor to the spokesman and advisor to the peace chief. And then you also had the chief in charge of war, the war chief, who was selected based on his exploits and prowess in warfare. And again, here are the sources that I have for all of that information. Now we're going to go and take a look at what Chickasaw villages and towns look like. So at the onset of the early 1700s, generally the villages of the Chickasaw Nation, as well as the villages of all southeastern Native American nations, looked something like this. Their houses were made out of things like wattle and daub, clay, and had thatched roofing, but there was also birch bark and log constructed buildings like you see here and here. And they had walled fortifications and were very much cities and towns. Which now leads us to actually our next section, the economy of the Chickasaw Nation, because these were large settlements, and how did they survive? What was their subsistence methods? Well, for one thing, the traditional Chickasaw agriculture was based off of crops such as corn, beans, and squash. And again, was the case for most Native American nations in North America, or at least in the eastern woodlands and even in the Great Plains to a large degree. But not just that, Chickasaws would also harvest animals such as deer, and the members of the Chickasaw Nation who were closer to the Great Plains would also hunt animals such as bison, because bison back then actually had a much wider range than they did even say during the what we would know as like the Wild West time of the United States during like the 1860s through the 1890s. But they would also fish and harvest various types of fish like catfish. Not only that, after contact with Europeans, the Chickasaw Nation would become a major participant in the deerskin trade, i.e., hunting deer for their skins to sell in markets. And they would disperse these all across very well established trading paths, like you see in this map here. And you can again see this in the archaeological record by quite a lot, as discussed in this paper titled Measuring Chickasaw Adaptation on the Western Frontier of the Colonial South, a correlation of documentary and archaeological data by J.K. Johnson et al. And, of course, as this paper implies, they examined a variety of different Chickasaw settlements dated to the early colonial period. And what they found is that over the course of this period, the early as well into the late colonial period, they used a range from 1650 to 1750, that they found that there was a large number of butchered deer remains, evidence of the butchering of deer. And you can see this trend grow over time. Whereas, like in the 1650s, there were not that many. Comparatively, there was more older versions, but then as time went on, you would begin to see more and more young specimens of deer show up. in greater numbers. And then they would take and they would trade these for European goods, which you can see in this chart here by the frequency of gun spalls and other things indicating the trade of, for example, guns to the Chickasaw in this year trade, with, of course, not surprisingly, the majority of these being of British origin, though there were some French examples there. And here's again that more, and again you see more gun parts, with again by and large the majority of gun parts coming from Britain as well as France, and then of course brave goods of European manufacture were found in high numbers as well. So this was a very lucrative, most definitely a very lucrative trade economy that the Chickasaw Nation had inserted itself into. It profited off it quite a lot, and the archaeological record most certainly backs that up. And you can see this again here. And this is just the general conclusions and the summary of the time periods. I provided this so you could understand what like late and early and etc. What they were meaning by late, early, middle period, based off of that. All right, now we're going to move into the meat of the video, the main subject of the video, the Chickasaw French Wars, starting with the background leading up to them. So first off, after the establishment of the colony of Carolina, yes, for those of you in the United States, the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, used to be one singular Carolina. But this colony of Carolina was established by the British Empire in 1665 CE. And after it was established, the Chickasaw Nation would establish a relationship with the British, with the Chickasaw Nation becoming a major participant in the Native American slave trade and the deerskin trade, often raiding rival Native American nations for captives to be sold in European slave markets. And here is pictures showing those industries that were being that the Chickasaw Nation had entered into. At the same time that this was all happening, the French Empire was beginning to expand into the North American interior, eventually founding the Louisiana colony with New Orleans as its capital city. And this would in turn lead to the Chickasaw Nation and the French Empire becoming bitter enemies because Britain and France were rivals in trade. And here is the map of sort of the earliest French expeditions into the interior, and you can see that they were relatively small, starting off in the 1690s and early 1700s, but eventually they would expand exponentially to include most of the North American interior, or at least the, what we would consider, like, say, the Midwest section of the United States, and of course Canada and things like that. And here is New Orleans, a map of New Orleans from around that time period here. Right around the, just a few years before the Chickasaw Wars really kicked off, the French Empire would go to war with a separate Native American nation called the Natchez Nation, eventually defeating the Natchez Nation in war and essentially removing their power and collapsing their political structure that would eventually lead to large numbers of Natchez refugees to flee to the Chickasaw Nation and, of course, join the Chickasaw Nation itself, with this war specifically happening sometime in 1729 CE. And then while that was happening, the French, who were, of course, not happy that the Chickasaw were trading with the British Empire, began to suggest to the Choctaw Nation, essentially egg the Choctaw Nation on into raiding the Chickasaw Nation on behalf of the French Empire, with this being specifically sort of started by the French governor of the Louisiana colony, Jean-Baptiste Le Monnier de Bienville, who again sought to specifically end the trade between the Chickasaw and the British Empire permanently. With these repeated raids happening between the 1720s, we don't know exactly when they began, but sometime in the 1720s up until about 1736 CE. Which now brings us to the Chickasaw French Wars themselves. Starting with the Chickasaw Campaign of 1736 CE. So on February 28, 1736 CE, Bienville would assemble a French army as well as 400 Native American warriors from French allied Native American nations, including the Illinois Confederacy. After assembling the force, he would march towards the Chickasaw Nation with the intent of, one, destroying the Natchez remnants who were within the Chickasaw Nation, and two, to permanently reduce or permanently break or reduce Chickasaw power in the region. Which actually means we need to very quickly take a look at what the French soldiers and weapons looked like at the onset of the Chickasaw French Wars. So in the early 1700s, 1700 to roughly 1740, 1750-ish, generally the French military looked something like this. You had infantrymen who looked generally like this, and you had carabiners who, what would be essentially the equivalent of, say, dragoons and British and American forces, who looked something like this. And the weapons that they used are probably very unsurprising. Generally, officers and carabiners wielded sabers and swords that looked something like this. And then, of course, they both used pistols of this design. This is very much a French pistol from that time period. And muskets, of course, rifle, guns, long-range guns, muskets were used by both the carabiners and the musketeers, the infantry. That being said, despite being a gunpowder force, and despite the French Empire being one of the most powerful forces nations in the world at the time, the French expedition led by Bienville into the Chickasaw Nation would be repeatedly defeated by the Chickasaw, specifically at the battles of Ogula, Techoka. I apologize. Ogula Techoka on March 25th, 1736 CE, and then 2 months later again at the Battle of Akia on May 26th, 1736 CE. And this was because the Chickasaw were, one, too well armed. They had been provided with a lot of weapons by the British, and the Chickasaw villages were too heavily fortified for the French expedition to overcome. Remember back in the Chickasaw warfare section, how I mentioned that the use of fortifications would be important in this video? This is why. The Chickasaw knew the advantage that they held in their fortifications, and they used it to win this war, to win this conflict. And eventually, Bienville's expedition was forced to return to New France. However, that would not stop him from trying again in the Chickasaw Campaign of 1739 CE. So, specifically on July 24th, 1739 CE, Bienville would assemble another French army consisting of even more French soldiers, 1,200 French soldiers specifically, and 2,400 allied Choctaw warriors at Fort Assumption within New France. However, very similar to the previous expedition, as the force marched into Chickasaw territory, it met a lot of setbacks. One, this time the expedition would be plagued heavily by disease. Uh, but on top of that, the rugged terrain uh, made it to where the French expedition could not bring artillery with them, cannons and things like that. So, because of the lack of artillery that the French expedition, the French army was still unable to breach the heavily fortified Chickasaw villages. Though it should be noted that the Chickasaw did uh, eventually turn over some of the Natchez that were within uh, their nation, and this is because the Chickasaw were not they were not naive. We'll put it that way. They were not naive individuals. They knew what was going on. They knew that while it was by no means uh, impossible for them to win. It was also not impossible for a concerted effort by such a large force to storm their fort. Um, Especially considering that both forces were relatively equal. The Chickasaw generally had around 2,000 warriors at their disposal, whereas this force was around 3,000 to 4,000. So they were fairly comparable. And while the Chickasaw most certainly could win and have the advantage of fortification, that did not mean that repeated efforts to breach would eventually result in a French victory. So, as an offer to peace, the Chickasaw would turn over some of the Natchez uh, refugees to the French Empire, though that did not stop this from still being a Chickasaw victory over the French Empire. And it also did not stop the French Empire from yet again trying again. Only this time it would be under a different individual because due to his repeated failures, Bienville would be replaced by Pierre de Rigaud, the Marquis of Vaudreuil Cavagnol, who would lead yet another expedition against the Chickasaws, only to also being able to defeat the Chickasaw forts. And he would do this in 1752 CE. Now, this is the end of the information I have for this expedition, and that's because the expedition is mentioned in the sources, but the sources give absolutely no detail whatsoever about this expedition. So, which in itself, one could argue is pretty telling. I would assume that this means that there were just as many, if not more, setbacks for de Brigade as there were for Bienville, and perhaps de Brigade and the sort of higher ups, the bureaucracy of the French Empire, did not want to mention those in the sources. I don't know that that is the case, but it wouldn't be surprising. But regardless, we do know this expedition happened and failed, even with the lack of information. All right, which leads us to our last section, the aftermath of the Chickasaw French Wars. Well, for one thing, the repeated failure of all three French expeditions into the Chickasaw Nation would allow the Chickasaw Nation to remain one of the five most powerful southeastern Native American nations. These groups eventually becoming known as the five civilized tribes. And of course, civilized is a very loaded term, but that is their official designation. Meanwhile, it is important to note that skirmishes did continue between the Chickasaw Nation and France, but they would eventually come to an end after France ceded all of its claim to the region east of the Mississippi River after the French Empire was defeated by the British Empire in the 7 Years' War. Which brings us to the end of our video. So there you have it. There is yet another there's yet another video in my series about early colonial debacles that disprove the myth of inherent European colonial superiority. This very much does fit within that category. After all, the Chickasaw humiliated the French Empire not once, not twice, but 3 times at least. So, very cool thing to hear about just how much of a debacle this was for the French Empire. So, yeah, with that, I'm going to end the video. If y'all want to see me cover any of the things I mentioned in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.